just wanted to formally welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. From across the globe, really, we have not only presenters that you'll hear from today from the US, the UK, and the EU, but also registrants from last I checked, 39 unique countries, which is pretty amazing. And I think really demonstrates what a wide-reaching challenge regulatory compliance in the software supply chain is, and managing this threat that truly bears no borders. For those that don't know me, my name is Charlie Jones. I'm a director of product management here at ReversingLabs. I specifically oversee our software supply chain security product, Spectra Assure, and I will be the moderator for today's virtual event, one I've looked forward to for a very long time because we have an incredibly interesting agenda, which now onto the fun stuff. What are we going to be covering today? We'll start with an overview of the EU legal and regulatory framework. We will then explore this kind of common thread across a select few of these regulatory publications, which is this keen focus that the European Commission has on the software supply chain. At which point we'll dovetail into a panelist discussion where we have some very esteemed guests joining us who you will hear from in a second. And then finally, we'll open it up for live questions at the end from the audience. But before we get too far, I wanted to introduce each of these panelists who we have joining us today. Starting first with Steve Purser. Steve is the previous head of core operations at ENISA, the European Security Agency, and former security executive at several kind of large financial institutions in Europe. We're lucky enough to have Steve join us and actually kicking off the content today, giving us an overview of the regulatory and legal framework in the EU, which he very much had a part in forming. So welcome, Steve. Please quickly tell us about yourself and kind of what excites you about this topic.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you here today. A bit about myself. So I am now 65 years old. I was educated in chemistry and then theoretical physics, which actually is important here because, as you know, we're moving into the quantum area, and a lot of what I was doing there was quantum stuff. I've been in cybersecurity for over 30 years, of which 15 years were in the financial sector, as you mentioned, large institutions. But the second 15 years were with the EU Cybersecurity Agency, ENISA, where I was head of operations. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this when you pass over to me for the introduction.
Amazing. Thank you, Steve. And it's great to have you. Next, we're joined by a previous colleague and friend of mine, Rizwan Nazir, who helps lead PwC's TPRM and outsourcing service in the UK, and specifically serves as PwC's expert on the Digital Operational Resilience Act, otherwise known as DORA, in that capacity. So Rizwan will be providing us some great insights into DORA's impact on managing supply chain risk in the financial service industry. So welcome, Rizwan. Please introduce yourself to the audience and tell us what you're focused on these days at PwC.
Perfect. No, thanks, Charlie. And also delighted to be here today as well, alongside the other panelists. So yeah, really looking forward to a good discussion and also, I guess, sharing and also gaining insights from my perspective in terms of how do we proactively, I guess, navigate the impact of these regulations in a pragmatic manner. It is my role, yeah, absolutely. So currently a director in PwC's financial services risk practice. So based in London, specialise in all things third-party risk management and outsourcing across the financial services market. So what that means is that I help clients to design, implement and optimize complex TPRM related initiatives across a range of firms. And that includes whether it's advisory, regulatory driven initiatives, but also managed service programs as well. I have spent the last couple of years focused on DORA across our clients and markets, and I continue to support many clients around the DORA-related obligations, even though we've passed enforcement date, which was January 2025, which has come and gone. We are still trying to navigate some of the headwinds associated with achieving compliance with many clients as well. So yeah, no, good to be here, Charlie. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Rizwan, for the introduction. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Sasha Zdielar, our Chief Trust Officer at ReversingLabs. A resume I probably couldn't do justice. Sasha joins us with over 20 years of experience in security across a wide range of sectors, covering everything from energy to tech. He sits on a number of advisory boards and councils, including Black Hat, the National Technology Security Coalition, Forbes Technology Council, and many more. So thank you very much, Sasha, for joining us today. Tell us about yourself in this unique role you have at ReversingLabs.
Well, I don't think I can add much more to what you've already said, so I'll just say I'm looking forward to the conversation with this absolutely incredible panel of folks we've assembled.
Cool. Well, thank you, Sasha, again for joining. Special thanks to all of our panelists. You'll hear from them again in a bit, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with what I'm going to unofficially dub our sort of kind of micro keynote presentation from Steve on the current state and evolution of EU's legal and regulatory framework as it relates to cybersecurity. So, Steve, take it away.
Yes, so thank you very much. Perhaps a good starting point would be to introduce ENISA to you. So ENISA is the EU Cybersecurity Agency. The acronym is actually very old-fashioned. What it did used to stand for is European Network and Information Security Agency. It was formed in 2004, and its role is to support EU institutions and EU member states in policy development and in developing cybersecurity legislation. So it's really a sort of open market approach to things. It didn't initially have a role in things like incident handling or operations. It was to improve how cybersecurity affects the internal market. Now, as a result of a thing called the Cybersecurity Act, which I'll tell you a little about later in 2019, the agency also now has an additional operational role. So it does help member states when coordinated attacks against European member states occur, and it has a major role in developing schemas for cybersecurity certification, which is quite a big thing in Europe at the moment. So think of the agency as a sort of technical support, carrying out key studies and projects that feed into policy development and legislative development in the EU. Now, what I'd like now to do, as Charlie said, is just give you a sort of very quick introduction to the cybersecurity scene in the EU and why it looks like it does. But before I say anything, I want to introduce two principles to you. One is called the subsidiarity principle. And what this means, it's Euro jargon to say that we always do things in Europe at national level, unless there's a very good reason to do it at European level. So it's a sort of delegation principle that if you don't need to do it at European level, you don't, you do it at national level. Conversely, if it has an advantage, you do it at European level. And secondly, I want to distinguish between two types of legislations, because this is going to come later. We have directives and we have regulations. A directive is something that's released by the European legislative mechanism, but it is transposed into national law. In other words, it is rewritten to a certain extent to reflect national priorities. And there's a transposition time for that. A regulation is a completely different sort of thing. It applies immediately and in the same form to all of the 27 member states. So there are certain differences there. But let's recap on where we are and how we got there. And the story begins in 2007. It's a long while ago, so maybe I'm the only person who can really remember this important date. But in fact, in 2007, there was a coordinated cyber attack on Estonia, and it had quite drastic consequences and brought several of the country's essential services down for quite a long time. So this, of course, created a thought process in Europe, which began quite fast. And well, I say quite fast. Remember, we're in the legislative domain. So the first sort of deliverable of this thought process was a commission communication of 2009, which was called Protecting Europe from Large-Scale Cyber Attacks and Disruptions. If you ever had the chance to read this, it's absolutely worth it. It's only about 15 pages, and it really shows you the root of everything that's happening in Europe today. Almost all the mechanisms we use were born in this paper. So it's actually, it's called COM 2009-149, if you note that down. Really worth a read. And what you saw coming out of this paper was, in fact, 4 mechanisms. One was called the European Forum for Member States. The idea was that member states would get together and discuss cybersecurity issues on a regular basis. And this transformed over the years into a thing called the Cooperation Group, which is an essential part of the NIS directive and the NIS2 directive. It also put a lot of emphasis on CSIRTs, or CERTs as we called them in those days, Computer Emergency Response Teams. And this grew into the CSIRT network, which is also an important part of NIS and NIS2. The Pan-European Cybersecurity Exercise was born. We do this every 2 years. ENISA is the coordinator, and it's a huge hands-on exercise involving all the member states, very sophisticated, run every 2 years in a particular environment. And last but not least, we had the first European Public-Private Partnership, which was called EP3R, Public-Private Partnership in Resilience, which unfortunately didn't stand the test of time. but we later created other ones. So this was really a groundbreaking paper. We then go forward 5 years to the first EU cybersecurity strategy, which was in 2013. 3 lady commissioners introduced it, Commissioner Cruz, Ashton, and Malmström. And it had, I think, 5 pillars. We are most interested in Pillar 1, which announced the first piece of EU cybersecurity legislation, which was called the NIS Directive, Network Information Security Directive. Pillar 2 built on the recently launched European Cybercrime Centre to fight cybercrime. So this sits in Europol, and its focus is on battling cybercrime. And Pillar 4 was a public-private approach to network and information security solutions. So you can see the same sort of themes that was in this first initial paper. Jump forward again to the NIS Directive. This was the first piece of EU cybersecurity legislation, so it's extremely important. And it rose out of Pillar 1 of this strategy, as I've just said. The idea is to protect those essential services that are necessary for a member state to carry on running. So think energy grids, think hospitals, think banks, anything that is necessary to carry on daily life is covered by the NISD. It distinguished between essential services, which are the big players, but it also covered digital service providers, which are things like digital markets and cloud service providers. The reflection here was that in the Fukushima incident, we found out that social media and cloud platforms were used as the primary source of communication when the telephone network went down. So they play an interesting role in resilience. At this time, some sectors and actors were out of scope. There were diverging security and incident reporting mechanisms. And moving forward, the experience with the COVID also shows us the need to speed up digital transformation, which the NISD started. We then had the Cybersecurity Act, which put NISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency, on a permanent footing. And it gave NISA this operational mandate to be able to support member states in incident handling. And it also created the EU cybersecurity certification framework. So the idea here is that certain things, think of 5G or common criteria products like smart cards, etc., will be certified at the European level, so that companies only need to get themselves certified once, and they're in a global market across the EU. So this was very important. We then had the second NIS directive, which is 2023, which built on the first directive. This widened the scope, so we have new entities coming, new sectors coming into place. We also have a new characterization of organizations as being essential and important. Essential are subject to much harder constraints and much bigger penalties if things go wrong. Important, well, they're still important, but they get a lighter journey, if you like. Interestingly, NIS2 was the first real instrument to cover supply chain security, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later. And then just to mention something which is very similar, but is restricted to the financial sector. So we have DORA, which is the Digital Operations Resilience Act. And this is pretty much like NIS2, but tailored to the needs of the financial sector. And this all culminates in a thing called the Cyber Solidarity Act. I won't go over it. It's much of the same thing. So this whole stream really was the backbone of European cybersecurity legislation until quite recently. But it wasn't the only game in town. In parallel, and of course, you all know, we have the data protection regulation. So this is a regulation, not a directive, remember. Huge impact, affects virtually everything. Developed by a separate area of the Commission, and the beginning was perhaps difficult to put these things together. There were some conflicts in terms of what was expected and how to do things, but this is now much better and much more aligned, I would say. And then you have a final pillar of legislation, which I call, and this is not a formal taxonomy, but I think of it like this. You have a whole series of legislation, which I call targeted legislation, and which is really targeting technological advancements on the whole. So what are we thinking of here? Well, in 2014, we had EIDAS. This is the European ID, electronic ID, evolving towards the concept of electronic wallets. We had the Cyber Resilience Act, which is immensely important, and I'm going to say a few words in a minute. And we had the AI Act covering AI. So cyber resilient attacks is going to come up today because this is really where the biggest impact on software supply chains is. It aims to safeguard customers and businesses buying software or hardware products with a digital component. So what does it address? It addresses the poor level of security in some products, the lack of timely security updates, the kind of information that is typically provided to the client, which is not always what it should be, especially from a cybersecurity perspective, and the way in which that information is passed to the client. So the Cyber Resilience Act entered into force on 10th of December 2024, but really the main obligations will be introduced by 11th of December 2027. 4 areas of focus here, they're all going to come up today, I'm sure. Rules for making available on the market products with digital elements. So now it's harder to introduce a software product or any product with software in there onto the market. Requirements for design, development, and production of such products. Requirements on vulnerability handling, and rules on market surveillance. There's a bit of a sting in the tail here. I'll mention it quickly. This whole thing links to a piece of legislation which was in 2008, which is called the New Legislative Framework, which handles the CE mark. This is a mark we put on products to say that we're happy with the fact that they can be put on the market. And this introduces the possibility of civil litigation to people distributing software, well, releasing or distributing software on the market. So what are the conclusions? To date, the Commission has been concentrating on initiatives to support resilience and critical information infrastructure protection, but there's been an increase in technology-related legislation in recent years, and this is likely to continue. And I would say, you know, the US is following a very similar path. And I think I'll finish there.
Amazing. Thank you, Steve. Very insightful. A great way to set the scene for today's webinar. Now, before we get into the panel itself, one of the things I wanted to quickly explore was this common thread between a number of regulations that Steve just alluded to, which is this kind of keen focus that the EU has on the security and resilience of the digital supply chain. And so what I've done here is extracted real language directly from a few of these regulatory publications to demonstrate this just isn't me or ReversingLabs saying this is important, but instead you have established oversight bodies making it clear that this topic is not only important, but mandatory to address if you want to do business in the EU. So I've arranged a few from left to right here, just starting a bit more high level in general, and then we'll get more explicit and industry focused as we go on to the right, just to give you a taste of the range of requirements that do exist. So first we start with NIS2. NIS2 is the very creatively named follow-on to NIS, as Steve mentioned, the first ever EU-wide cyber legislation. Now, with the initial NIS directive, we experienced some kind of fragmented adoption by EU member states that were enforcing this. So with NIS2, not only are we seeing stronger enforcement requirements, but also updates to the subject matter of the directive to bring it into the modern age, addressing security concepts like Steve mentioned of digital supply chain security. So on the bottom row, you can see an extract which actually comes from the preamble of NIS2, where not only does it explain the European Commission's recognition of these heightened number of attacks on third-party products and services, which include software, but more importantly, the need for organizations to manage that risk more effectively. As we go on, we'll get a bit more detailed as we move to the Cyber Resilience Act. Joanna, if you can just hit the next slide here. The CRA is significant because nowhere in the previous legal framework is there legislation that addresses the cybersecurity of non-embedded software. And so we'll see the CRA introducing these requirements through their coverage of, Steve mentioned this before, but products with digital elements. So I again pulled a few quotes from it so you can see how it starts to get a bit more specific, not to the supply chain more generally, but to the software supply chain. So it talks about the need to produce a software bill of materials, otherwise known as an SBOM, for any software package that is published to the EU market. It also talks about the need to facilitate the sharing of known risks like vulnerabilities that exist within third-party components that make up a product. And finally, the need to report any severe incidents which may have downstream customer impact. So it calls out more sinister events like the compromise of a trusted release channel of a software vendor, where malicious code is being inserted into an update of that software, very much like the kind of notorious SolarWinds attack. And then finally here we have DORA, which is the last kind of slide here. Joanne, if you go forward one more, perfect. DORA, again, was designed to enforce stricter requirements on EU financial entities. Here you'll see some similarities to the CRA in the security requirements of software that it enforces. So again, looking for known risks and threats like malware, vulnerabilities, tampering of releases and updates. And in addition, it adds some things like sensitive information leakage in software, the importance of that. But what's unique about DORA is this focus it has on third-party ICT products and services that are actually consumed and onboarded by financial entities. And the explicit need to not only understand what is in those products that you're procuring through the likes of an SBOM, but also testing them to make sure they are safe before they are deployed into that production environment of a financial service entity. If we go to the next slide, this is where it starts to get really interesting to me. When you compare CRA and DORA side by side, we start to see this divergence in how certain oversight bodies view ownership and accountability of this risk. So on the left, you have the CRA that states that cybersecurity capabilities of digital products are the sole responsibility of manufacturers and distributors of software. And it goes to the extent, Steve kind of mentioned this before, but if a market surveillance authority has reason to believe that software suppliers aren't adequately mitigating cyber risk and conforming to these standards that they've set out, they can actually recall or withdraw that product from the market. Now, DORA, on the other hand, takes a very different view. DORA states it's the responsibility of financial entities to withstand, detect, and recover from any type of disruption or threat, irrespective of where it originates from. And that distinction is very important because it takes the view that regardless of whether you decide to strategically keep something in-house or outsource it to, for example, a third-party software vendor, you are solely responsible for ensuring it's secure. So now we've had the opportunity to kind of set some context around these regulatory requirements that exist in the EU and their applicability to the software supply chain. Let's go ahead and bring the rest of our panelists up on stage so you can hear a bit more from them and their experiences instead of just kind of listening to me drone on all day. So first, let's dive into some of the challenges that are presented by these regulatory obligations. We'll start first with you, Sasha. We saw in that NIS2 preamble that digital supply chain security is, or digital supply chains more generally, are being increasingly targeted by malicious actors because of this nature that they introduce. So can you just help us understand what makes a software supply chain so complex in the first place, and why are so many large organizations with seemingly very mature cybersecurity programs just starting to adopt foundational capabilities in this domain?
Yeah, it's a great question, Charlie. So, first let's start by maybe understanding what do all of our companies rely on. So whether you are a technology company like us at ReversingLabs, or a software producer like a Salesforce or an SAP or a Microsoft, or whether you're a software consumer, your traditional kind of end user consumption, Pepsi, ExxonMobil, Procter & Gamble, Boeing, Airbus, whoever, right? The entire world runs on software. We could not run our businesses if we didn't have software. I think that was not necessarily the case maybe 30 years ago, right? Lots of ledgers. Let's write on indigo paper, 3 copies. I'll tear it off. I send to you. You write me a check, a lot of different ways of transacting business. That's not really the way we do business anymore, right? Today's business is kind of a cliche statement. We'll just say very digital, right? Very digitized. So we all rely on software to help make our business more efficient. It's the reason why we don't need 3 times as many people, because automation, because software, because whatever. At the same time, the software manufacturers want their software to be developed with the lowest cost of goods sold, or COGS, possible. So a lot of the stuff that doesn't have to be built in-house isn't. So it's outsourced, offshored, nearshored, whatever it is. And if you're a developer, there's no reason for you to develop a authentication routine or a piece of subcode if that's already been written and put up somewhere like, I don't know, Stack Overflow or some open source component or something like that. So really, when we say software development, what people don't realize is these days it's mostly software construction, right? We are taking Lego blocks built by others, in some cases because they can build it better, faster, cheaper, and we construct software. And then there's still some code that we write in-house. So most software out there that's used by corporations is a piece of first-party code, meaning stuff our own developers write, but then many, many pieces are components built by others. So components that are either proprietary, commercial, or open source that we bring into our own code. We put that together, and that becomes a software that's sold to vendors. So we are in this highly, highly interconnected, highly globalized software environment where the software that we use to run our companies is really written by dozens, if not hundreds of entities, some of whom are known and licensed and commercial and background checked and vetted, and some of whom are not, because we don't know the provenance or background of a developer that is a single maintainer sitting somewhere overseas, potentially in a very undesirable geography, of a single kind of open source component that happens to be very popular. So, as the popular saying goes, why hack in when you can log in? And hackers are like water. They take the path of least resistance. So if there's a way for them to get in that doesn't involve some sort of brute forcing of a password, whatever, that those days are kind of generally gone, they will just kind of find their way into an open source component. And by that way, kind of on a multiplicative affect hundreds, if not thousands, of software packages on the planet by getting into a component. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely does. And I think you touched on complexity a bit here that's introduced by outsourcing and reliance on third-party dependencies for parts of the software that you don't produce yourself, which I think is really insightful. I'd love to hear a bit more about complexity from you, Steve, in slightly a different sense. When you're working at NISA and helping lay the foundation for NIS2, CRA, a lot of these frameworks during your time, I'm curious what kind of challenges you came across in crafting maybe regulations that cover a topic as complex as software supply chain, which Sasha just described, while also not being overly prescriptive, because we know that causes a lot of strain amongst entities that are regulated at the end of the day and need to meet whatever requirements you set out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is actually much more challenging than you might expect at first, because, of course, you have a similar situation in the States. You have difference between federal approach and state approach. But I would say it's even more divergent in Europe, where in many countries we don't even speak a common language. And this shows itself very strongly in policy development. So member states have developed very different ways of solving problems. Let me give you an example. Some member states, and in the time when the UK was a member of the EU, supported a market-driven approach to cybersecurity. And I think this is pretty much what you have in the States. Whereas others, I'm thinking of France and Germany, these are all my opinions, by the way, but this is how I saw it, were more in favor of a strong policy and legislative framework. And these are to some extent in contradiction with each other. On the one hand, for a market-based approach, you don't want too many rules, etc. So it was difficult finding the right balance in these kind of things. As a concrete example, I remember the UK was much more in favor of voluntary information sharing, whereas the EU eventually has introduced much more obligatory mechanisms, e.g. the reporting schemes in these different things, right? There was also some member states were using asset-based classification, some process-based, some a mixture of both. And even when it comes to basic risk analysis, some member states use asset-based risk analysis, some use scenario-based. So putting these together is not easy. And in fact, we did a European-wide risk analysis of 5G, and that's exactly what we had to do, and it took quite some time. Second point is taxonomies and cybersecurity metrics. I think this is a global problem anyway. It's not restricted to the EU. But, there is no real standardization of taxonomies and metrics, which means it's very difficult to compare and contrast across geographical boundaries. And this is going to be a huge problem for the future, because if you don't have these things, it's very difficult to make progress because you don't really know what you're measuring. And not only are the metrics and the taxonomies different, but the thresholds are different. If you take a country like Luxembourg, which has a relatively small population, you cannot compare threshold values for Luxembourg with someone like Germany, which has an extremely large population. So it seems obvious when you mention it, but when you're actually in the business of doing it, it's quite hard. Third point, legislation is a very slow-moving, brutal instrument. In some senses, to my mind, it's a last resort to solving a problem. Technology moves very fast. I think the trick in writing legislation is to capture functional requirements without referencing specific technologies. And as far as this is possible, having said that, we're definitely moving in the other direction. I mean, even in the States, you had the California Senate Bill 327 on connected devices, which goes deeper into the technology. And we see this happening in Europe as well. But let me finish with supply chain and software, because this is really what we're mainly interested in. This has really been extremely challenging. So NISA produced the first analysis of this problem in 2015. And at that time, we said that we were looking for solutions in certification, supply chain integrity frameworks, and some legal recommendations. Took a long while before this came about. In fact, the states beat us to it in the chief, what I believe is the chief instrument that we'll be using in the future, which is the famous SBOM, as you or your Sasha already mentioned. But it's been integrated into the CRA. It's an obligatory requirement of the CRA. That's a good thing. But let me tell you what we found in practice. So when NISA went actually out to organizations and measured what was really happening, this was in 2023. We found out that 86% of the surveyed organizations implement supply chain security policies, or I should say write them, because it's different. Because we found only 47% allocate any budget to this and really do anything. So that's a huge difference. And there are 76% that do not have dedicated roles and responsibilities for supply chain security at all. So I'll just end by mentioning that, you know, across the EU, we're looking for risk-based approaches to cybersecurity, and we are looking for non-prescriptive laws. And when you mix this all into the mix, you can see, to answer your question, just how difficult it is to come up with a new piece of regulation and to satisfy all these criteria.
Yeah, no small task, I can imagine. Thank you, Steve. I wanted to pivot for a second to DORA to hear from Rizwan here, because we know that DORA is unique in the fact we talked about different levels of requirements. That's exactly what DORA does. You have these high-level abstract regulatory text of DORA, but you also have this set of implementation rules which underpins the high-level text for a variety of different functions, right? Risk management, incident reporting, critical third parties, and so on. So Rizwan, I'm hoping you can help explain the difference between what are dubbed these kind of level 1 and level 2 requirements and the complexities that those may introduce to regulated organizations.
Perfect. No, Charlie, happy to try and do that. So when I think of DORA, I guess the focus is about how do you embed a more robust and resilient approach to delivering digital capabilities. So, and it represents one of the most important, I guess, regulatory initiatives on operational resilience impacting the financial services sector. I also think it goes a considerable way to consolidate and upgrade requirements firms now face. And by that, I mean, basically you've got to adopt a broader business view of resilience with accountability clearly established at senior management level. And it also applies to the vast majority of firms that operate across the EU. I guess, as you rightly say, so DORA operates under the EU's two-tier legislative structure, often referred to as level 1 and level 2 requirements, which I think it sets it apart from some other regulations as well. So if I take the level 1 requirements, I guess the purpose of those are to establish the fundamental principles and framework for digital operational resilience, and the focus on the overall objectives of DORA as well. It's basically the core regulatory text adopted by the European Parliament and Council, and it also sets the high-level binding obligations for all in-scope financial entities. And as a result, these level 1 requirements, they're broad, they're strategic, and they're principles-based as well in nature. They also cover a range of topics or pillars. And so you've got, as you said, you've got ICT risk management, you've got incident reporting, you've got digital operational resilience testing, you've got obviously third-party risk management and outsourcing, and also information sharing as well. So that's all broadly level 1. And then this is complemented with the level 2 requirements. And what that is, it's basically a series of regulatory technical standards and implementing technical standards, or ITSs and RTSs is what they're normally referred to. These have been developed by the European Supervisory Authorities. So that covers EBA, ESMA and IOPA. And so these are the trio of regulatory bodies who operate in the EU who are responsible for overseeing and coordinating regulation across the financial services sector. And so the purpose of these standards is to provide the implementing precision through detailed rules, templates and methodologies to complement and implement those level 1 principles, if that makes sense. And so as a result, they're very detailed, they're very technical in nature, and they've also got lots of specificity and granularity as well. So if I take a couple of examples of that, so basically if you look at, for example, the incident reporting pillar, you've got level 1 regulation that talks about you've got to be able to report any major ICT related incidents to local competent authorities. So that's in level 1. Then you compare that to the implementation technical standard. That gives you the actual template you need to actually populate. It talks about the timelines you need to actually report to the regulator, and also any escalation procedures to be able to achieve that. And I think that creates some complexity, is what I'm seeing across the market, because you've got this dual burden of interpretation and implementation. So not just you've got those abstract level 1 requirements, you've got to ensure resilience. You've also got that scrutiny by the regulator to focus on not just having the framework, but also how does that align to those specific standards as well, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I think understanding the nuances between those two, as you just described, I think that was a perfect example, I think is really important for organizations to understand how you can actually achieve compliance with them. And I think that really frames kind of what I want to dovetail into our next conversation, which is what happens when you are not compliant? So what are the liabilities and consequences you may face if you aren't compliant with these new requirements that are emerging? First, we'll go back to you, Sasha. You've regularly spoken about the topic of kind of executive accountability and liability. Can you talk a bit about the impact that Steve had mentioned, some of these institutional and civic requirements and consequences that are introduced by CRA, DORA, and so on? What do those have on executive liability, and what does that mean for the role of the Chief Information Security Officer, which we see often ending up as the scapegoat in a lot of these high-profile supply chain compromises?
Yeah, it's a it's a fascinating topic because it also is very differently, I think, viewed and handled in Europe versus in the US. The kind of commonality of a CISO role existing is a little bit more prevalent in the US than in Europe. In some cases, there is a head of security, but it is typically given like a director level title, which is why you even see some prominent trade shows. They might have a CISO summit in the US, but they have a senior executive summit in Europe because the title is not as common. But which kind of speaks a little bit to the positioning within the corporation. I think in the US, we tend to have more CISOs in named CISO roles, while we have a very similar scope existing in Europe, maybe not with the same title. Now, what is also different between the two jurisdictions, and I say two in a kind of royal sense, really it's not two, right? It's 1 plus 50 in the US and 1 plus different tiers plus however many member countries in Europe. So lots of complexities there. And even between NIS and DORA and ECRA and some others, there's different levels of accountability. But I think at maybe a parent level, what is common across all the geographies in the world is that the degree of accountability for the CISO, or whatever the title is called, has over time only gone up, right? It has not gone down in any jurisdiction. So think about analogous to maybe what the CFO was, pre-Sarbanes-Oxley in the US, days of financial regulation. The CISO, or whatever the title for the role is effectively becoming the cyber CFO. And we're heading towards a world where that role and the accountability is being viewed in a similar light. It's being, and the goalpost on standard of due care also seems to be shifting in the direction of, used to be kind of, did you know? And it's now more of a world of should you have known? And do you have the types of controls in place to have known? So again, different between the jurisdictions, but generally the personal accountability and the level of scrutiny for the role is increasing. And we are seeing, at least in the US, right, in the last few years, we've seen a number of CISOs being personally held liable and accountable, being called up by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US for what's called a Wells notice, to be personally answer for some of the security outcomes. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the topic we're discussing around supply chain, and some of we talked about how DORA might be a little bit different than NIS, whose responsibility is to kind of validate some of the software, and is it good? Is that the responsibility of the manufacturer? Is it the responsibility of the operator? What is also indisputable is that regardless of whose maybe liability is on paper or accountability, it's still your outcome if you're the CISO. right? So regardless of who you might be able to blame down the road and lawsuits and technicalities over the legalese, it's still your problem when it happens, right? If you're the CISO who's dealing with a massive outage, or you got ransomware, or a problem got into your environment because malware came as an implant in a piece of software, down the road, you may have the luxury to litigate why you lost the company. The reality is it's your problem the day that it happens. You're dealing with the aftermath, with the incident response, with how to get your business up and running. I think that's the key piece to understand here is today CISOs don't have a technical control for software supply chain. They have a lot of sort of, I'll call it security theater, a lot of questionnaires and cyber insurance and things that are sort of on the periphery of a control. What they really need is a technical control for software supply chain. And today they, very, very few exist, and it's something that I think CISOs are increasingly asking for because of the level of personal liability that they increasingly have.
Yeah, very, very insightful into individual accountability, certainly, particularly at the CISO level. Thank you, Sasha. Shifting slightly to institutional liability, question for you, Rizwan. In NIS2 and CRA, as we talked about before, there are some very clear consequences defined, right? NIS2, the famous 10 million euros or 2% of worldwide annual turnover, whatever's higher. And the CRA, I talked about it a bit before, but if you aren't meeting these conformity standards that Steve talked about before, the CE marking, your product can actually be withdrawn from the EU market. But with DORA, I understand the consequences aren't as clear cut. Can you kind of provide the audience insight into why that's the case?
Yeah, no, great observation, Charlie, and you're absolutely right. So I guess compared to NIS2 and CRA, DORA does not appear to have, I guess, immediately visible consequences for non-compliance. And I think there's a couple of reasons why they seem less explicit. Firstly, DORA leverages existing supervisory frameworks. So it's not a standalone enforcement regime. It's meant to integrate into the existing supervisory architecture for financial entities. And then the enforcement will be carried out by the local competent authorities across the European Union. So for example, BaFin in Germany, ACPR in France, etc., alongside the three European supervisory authorities in EBA, ESMA, and EIOPA. So these regulators already have powers to impose sanctions under sectoral regulations like CRD and CRR for banks, Solvency II for insurers, MiFID II for investment firms. So instead of DORA inventing a whole new penalty framework, it can use what's already in place. And then those enforcement tools are often tailored to the entity type and the severity of the incident or breach, if that makes sense. I think the other thing is worth saying is that DORA, as I mentioned, is principles-based regulation with some flexibility in that it's meant to be technology neutral and also flexible across entity types and sizes, but it is applicable to a broad range of financial services firms that operate across the EU. And then due to that nature and that flexibility, I do think trying to define a one-size-fits-all penalties construct, would be too tricky and too difficult to actually achieve by the regulators as well. And I guess the other thing worth adding is that DORA is also trying to promote ongoing supervisory engagement rather than immediate punitive actions. So, for example, firms may receive things like recommendations or improvement plans or remediation orders before fines are actually imposed as well. And so I think this approach of remedial before becomes punitive is actually quite helpful, as long as obviously firms are willing to comply with that as well. And I think that does, I guess, significantly vary in contrast with what NIS2 and CRA say around that hard enforcement regime, especially around the fact that there's market consequences such as product bans and reputational damage as well. But all of that said, I think even though there's not any hard and fast, rules around, specific sanctions and fines, it doesn't mean that the regulation lacks teeth. So regulators can and will revoke licenses, they can restrict activities, and they can impose penalties under existing sectoral laws as well. And so just got to bear that in mind. Even though consequences may seem indirect, they can be real and potentially severe, as well. And so especially the fact that if resilience failures do put the financial markets at risk as well.
Yeah, I think that proactive engagement is a really interesting approach. You mentioned it doesn't lack teeth. Reminds me of a question I actually had for Steve. Steve, one of the main fallouts I mentioned before from NIS, the first time it was ever implemented, was this fragmented adoption that was broadly kind of viewed across EU member states. Can you explain to us what's changed in this new regime of some of these publications that are coming out in NIS2, CRA, and so on, that will give these regulations teeth for enforcement?
Yeah, but first I'd like to build on two excellent answers. I really like what Sasha said about the CISO. I think this is a real problem in the industry. So I'm just going to say a couple of words about this. This is my opinion, but I don't think the system should work like this at all. To my mind, the people who are accepting the risk should be the business managers. These are the only people who can successfully put cybersecurity risk in the context of business risk and manage both at the same time. So for me, the CISO should be a sort of chef d'orchestre who is, directing resources to get the best value. But at the end of the day, the residual risk, as we call it, the risk that's left when you put in place your controls, should be signed off by the business managers. Unfortunately, it's not. And the other problem here is that, and Sasha alluded to it, the role of the CISO itself is undefined. And it varies enormously between organizations. I mean, in Europe, you get very young CISOs who just have technical skills and they haven't had the chance to develop the soft skills and the interpersonal skills necessary to take a C-level function. And so this is a very dangerous combination of circumstances. And that's where the scapegoat thing comes from, I think. The CISO, to my mind, should be a senior person capable of talking to business and technical alike, but should not, in my opinion at least, shoulder the responsibility, even though, as Sasha said, they end up doing so. Now, that having been said, there's a couple of things that have happened since the last wave of legislation which make a big difference. And one of them is there are two articles in these NIS2 and DORA which are key to illustrate this. Article 5 of DORA and Article 20 of NIS2, and they both deal with the level of responsibility and accountability of boards. And they're very tough. So what they both essentially say, they're very similar in wording. You could almost imagine they're copied from each other. Boards need to do several things. They need to keep themselves up to date on cybersecurity risks affecting their organizations. But they're also required to keep their staff up to date and aware of the evolving risk landscape. This is the first requirement. And this is, I think, will be interpreted very pragmatically. I mean, we will not get away at board level in the future with some kind of wishy-washy argument about general risks, etc. They'll have to demonstrate a true understanding of risks as it applies to them. Not only that, boards are actually expected to be actively involved in all phases of risk management and not just the initial risk analysis phase. In other words, they're expected to follow up on initiatives and be aware of how their risk exposure is evolving. So, if you've got a big risk mitigation project and it's not going well, the board should know about that and should take a position on it if necessary. And it's interesting to note that DORA, for instance, does define punitive measures that can also affect the boards. In theory, you can take someone off a board, for instance. So I think this is a big change, yeah? And I think this is one of the major ways in which this will play out. I have to say, honestly speaking, my own experience, and I know a lot of similar-minded and similar experienced people experience this as well. It's very hard to concentrate boards, even if you've got important stuff to tell to them. So it's going to be interesting to see, what wakes up this community and really gets them acting. Otherwise, I do foresee some negative consequences. You mentioned the fines, so the 10 million, 7 million, or the percentage of global annual revenue. My feeling on this is that we have not been particularly good at enforcing these mechanisms, despite the high fines. There have been a couple of high-profile cases in terms of GDPR. They've been years in the courts. So, I think the enforcement mechanism is a bit weak, my opinion, and I think it needs to be strengthened. And I hope this is one of the things that's going to happen in moving forward. But the scenario should be, as from now, that there will be more board level training, more board level accountability, and this will filter down throughout the company to bring better results. That's the theory, at least.
I think that's great. And we actually got a question as you started talking, Steve, that I think's largely been answered. It was about responsibility of cyber incidents falling to execs. You kind of covered the delegation of that accountability and cyber risk to the boards, their role in all aspects of risk management and even kind of punitive measures.
So one precision, Charlie, I must make it because it's often not noticed, but some people interpret this as being board singular. It's not. If you follow the definitions through from the original legislation, it goes to other legislation. So it covers a variety of boards. So, it's the executive board within the company, but it's also the management board. It can be the board of share. It can be all kinds of things. So it needs interpreting for any particular organization. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's important to know.
No, it's the point about that's why we have you as our expert. It's always interpretable, and it's good to have the expert insights into what is meant when these regulations come out so that our listeners can help interpret them and enforce them in the right ways. Conscious we have about 10 minutes left. We talked about the challenges that have been presented by some of these new requirements and potential consequences of not meeting them. Always a bit of a bleak topic, so I figure let's end on a high note. What can our audience do as security practitioners, as GRC professionals to help their businesses meet these regulations? So a few minutes from each of you. We'll start with you, Sasha. You've successfully led third-party oversight and software assurance programs at very large global companies like ExxonMobil and Salesforce. So I'm curious if you can share some insights into what are some types of assurance and mitigation strategies that our listeners can actually adopt within their businesses to address this risk software supply chain more effectively?
Yeah, I think, part of the challenge is there are very few good answers here. And that's part of the why this is a big space and why the bad guys are going after it is unlike a lot of other areas of risk, there are historically not as many good airtight controls that you can put in place and say, if I've been able to implement this, now I feel good. Up until now, so let's talk about what is really software supply chain. It's either stuff that you produce internally, software for your own internal use. Okay, that's one kind of risk. It could be software that you produce internally for commercial purposes, meaning to sell it. So you're a software, provider. Or what is true for all of us is as a software consumer. So the software that you buy. So think about how traditionally we've approached software security. We've said, ooh, shift left. Let's shift as much left as we can. And you had acronyms like SAST, static application security testing, DAST, dynamic application security testing, SCA, software composition analysis. These are all fantastic things to be doing. Unfortunately, when it's software that you buy from others, you don't participate in any part of that shift left. You are buying it when all of that is done. So you are effectively taking the word of the vendor that what they've done to shift left is adequate or sufficient in this case, right? So, have they run static application security tests, dynamic tests, software composition analysis? The problem with all of those is none of those are designed to find things like tampering, malware, implants in software. They're designed to find other also highly problematic things, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, things that are also bad, vulnerabilities. But there are risks beyond vulnerabilities that are just as bad, or in some cases, far worse. Far worse. A piece of malware shipping from in software that you buy, that is not going to be something that SAST, DAST, or SCA tools find. Same thing with a tampered or, in some way, a backdoored CI/CD pipeline from a software manufacturer. Again, that's not something that these tools will find. So I think the number one takeaway or tip that I would have for folks is find a technical control that can take software as it's given to you. And the way it's given to you is as usually some type of a compiled binary. I mean, look at the platform we're on now. We're on Zoom. What do you get from Zoom when you buy it? You get zoom.exe. That's it. You get an executable. You install it on all your endpoints and in some cases in all your conference rooms and a bunch of other places. But you have no insights into what's in that binary unless you have a technical control that can tell you that. You can't SAST someone else's executable. You don't have access to source code. You can't DAST it. It's a binary. You can't SCA it. It's a commercial piece of software. So all the stuff that you might be investing into your own AppSec program doesn't apply when it's someone else's software. So the tip would be find a technical control or adopt technology that allows you to take software as you get it from the vendor and give you deep insights into it. Has it been backdoored? Has it been tampered with? Does it have malware? Are there vulnerabilities? Does it contain secrets? What is it doing on the network? Does it violate license? Does it have license violations? Which could be a different kind of liability for you down the road. So that to me is the most important thing in the future for securing the supply chain.
No, it's a really good point. Trying to find a control that captures all those risks and threats, which are maybe were previous best practice, are now codified into regulation that you need to meet. Really good point, Sasha. Steve, in addition to your time at ENISA, you had mentioned you were also a security executive at financial institutions in the EU. So I imagine kind of meeting these new emerging requirements in heavily regulated industries is nothing new to you. So I was curious if you can share some lessons learned with the audience in the last few minutes here about if you were in your role again, how do you address these types of emerging capabilities like software supply chain?
Sure. So I'm going to take a different take to Sasha. I'm going to be much more global in my recommendations. But look, I'm a very practical person, and I found over the years that pragmatism is what gets you through in security. So I'm going to say some pretty basic stuff. But as I say it, bear in mind it's not often done. So my first recommendation is ensure that you fully understand the problem before implementing the solution. You will be amazed at how many people dive towards technological software and things without really understanding the problem that needs to be solved. And this causes a lot of problems in the industry. So take the time to understand exactly the problem you're trying to solve before you dip into any kind of solution. Remember that successful security approaches always combine people, process, and technology. Yeah. Don't be tempted to think that the technology alone will solve your problem. It would be nice to believe that, we've got AI solutions coming out, etc. But no, it can never be. Why not? If you had a perfect AI solution, I, as an attacker, that's the first thing I would attack. And the way I do it probably will go through the people developing it or whatever. So it needs to be a sensible balance of people, process, and technology. Put a lot of effort into building a strong team and into keeping them motivated. So match people to tasks carefully so they're fully engaged. And the second thing here is don't give your team solutions. We're all very experienced people on this panel. We've had lots of experience. So the tendency is to say, do that. I think not. I think the best thing to say is solve this problem. And I found that when I've done that, people have really surprised me with their creativity. And more importantly, they take ownership for the thing. So they consider it as their baby, and they're the ones who nurse it through to the future. And last but not least, and this is really key to everything, a lot of things fail because of the basics. So concentrate on the basics. Some examples: policies and procedures should be short, sharp, easy to find, easy to understand, and regularly updated. You don't want 40-page procedures, for instance. Job description should be clear and up to date. Key staff should have a name backup who's trained to take over at a moment's notice. Critical staff should be vetted before employment. How many companies do this these days? If you take on a Unix administrator, that person is God on a Unix system. Yeah, it's really in your interest to vet what kind of person you're dealing with. And then other silly things like, you remember that when you move a person from one job function to another, you always give the new accesses because the manager's on your back to get them working. But you need to remember to take the old ones away. Otherwise, you get unhealthy accumulation. And it's all stuff like this. And really, this is what cripples companies. And this is where they really fail in real daily life. Last, I'll finish with an example. There was a very big PKI provider. I think it was in the Netherlands, huge, excellent at cryptography, excellent at PKI, failed and actually crashed. It went out of business because it did not handle the basics. So I think it was malware handling or something like this. And it did basically crash the business. Yeah. So basics are the key to everything.
I think basic risk management essentials are a great way of approaching the problem. That's honestly why I like DORA, because it clearly lays out some basic principles like make sure your software is safe before you deploy it, right? A basic capability that I imagine no one would argue, but people still somehow fail to implement. Lastly, to you, Rizwan, like the CRA and NIS2, DORA is now effective and enforceable. I'm curious if you can give us some insight into where is the financial service industry now in terms of addressing these obligations set out by DORA?
Happy to. Yes, I do think actually maturity and readiness varies across the industry, which is quite interesting. And so I think awareness is generally high, which I guess is great, but then execution tends to vary depending on larger firms versus smaller and mid-sized firms as well, if that makes sense. I think some of the challenges is around what we talked about around interpreting the requirements, whether it's level 1 versus level 2. And what it actually means. Resourcing the work continues to be a challenge as well. How do you transition and manage change programs and then embed that into your existing and anchoring frameworks as well? And then also scoping has been quite tricky for some firms as well around applicability and scoping the perimeter and the associated upstream and downstream impact of the legislation. And then also, I guess, the cross-regulatory integration as well that we've talked about. So I have seen some firms trying to trailblaze, trying to build a unified resilience framework that satisfies things like DORA, NIS2, CRA, and essentially try to drive a more efficient and effective approach as well. And I think that's where a lot of firms try to focus their effort, just to make sure they're collaborating across the different business units and regulators to try and build a resilience culture across their organizations.
Amazing. Thank you, Rizwan. Very timely, too. We've just come to the end of the hour. So, Joanna, let's cruise through the remainder of slides. I just want to first thank everyone for joining, both attendees for hanging in there through the entire hour, but more importantly, also to the panelists for contributing all the time that you have to this session. I really, really appreciate it. If you do have questions about this capability and control more broadly and would like me to connect you with any one of these panelists, or you'd like to talk to ReversingLabs about how you can potentially use our technology to address some of these capabilities, we would be more than happy to do so. We have some additional resources available for you on our website, or we can send them to you directly. Things like our software supply chain security report, where we have our dedicated threat research team digging into these attacks that are occurring every day. We have a publication, Software Supply Chain Security for Dummies, which I actually wrote myself alongside my colleagues Ashley Benj and Paul Roberts, which gives really good foundational fundamentals on how you should be approaching this issue. And then today, we just announced the release of some of our, what we're calling compliance cards, which go into detail about some of those excerpts we pulled from regulatory text today, like the CRA and DORA, and specifically how customers, both publishers of software and buyers of software, can use our products, specifically Spectra Assure, to help address some of these regulatory requirements that are emerging. We also have a number of webinars upcoming that you can, if you enjoyed your time here today, that you can register for and join as well. With that being said, thank you very much for everyone for coming, and please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Look, we're getting